Welcome to the deep dive. You're here because, well, you want to get a handle on the big stuff shaping our world, right? Quickly and without drowning in information. We get it.
Absolutely.
Today we're taking a deep dive into Yuval Noah Harari's 21 lessons for the 21st century. Think of it as your shortcut to understanding some really crucial trends.
That's a good way to put it. And, it's important to understand up front, this isn't like a history book, chapter by chapter.
Okay.
It's more like Harari's picked out these key lessons, these insights, really to get you thinking about the major conversations happening right now. The book actually came out of his talks, his interactions with people asking these big questions.
Right. So these major conversations, what are we actually talking about? What themes are we going to dig into that'll give listeners a clearer picture?
Okay, so we'll hit a few key areas. First, the big one. Technology, how the old stories are kind of falling apart, what the future of work might even look like.
Yeah, the job stuff is huge.
Huge. And liberty, personal freedom with big data getting so powerful. And inequality, that widening gap.
Okay, tech. What else?
Then we pivot to the political side. Things like, what does community even mean now? This idea of maybe a single global civilization.
Interesting.
The pull of nationalism, but also its limits. Religion's changing role, immigration, that whole complex picture.
And you mentioned post-truth.
Yeah, and finally we touch on that tricky idea of post-truth. What does it mean when it's hard to even agree on the facts?
Got it. So our mission here is basically to pull out those key insights about now and maybe get a glimpse of the future, especially where tech, politics, and our own identity all smash together. Ready to jump in?
Let's do it. So first up is this idea Harari talks about, the faltering liberal story.
Right.
For a long time, especially in the West, there was this dominant idea, right, individual liberty, democracy, free markets, that this was the way forward, the thing that would beat oppressive systems.
Yeah, definitely. The feeling that history was kind of moving in one direction. More freedom, more open societies. That was the narrative.
Really. But, and this is key, Harari points out this isn't the first time liberalism has hit a wall.
In fact?
World War I.
Okay.
That was a massive crisis. Globalization kind of collapsed. Powerful nations were grabbing land. It wasn't looking good for liberal ideals then either.
But it bounced back, didn't it? After all that horror, there was this push for a new world order, the League of Nations, the war to end all wars, based on those same ideas.
It did. But here's the contrast Harari draws with today. He suggests if people lose faith now, they might not flock to a new global vision. Instead, they might retreat.
Retreat where?
Back to more local things. Nationalism, maybe certain religious stories. And while nationalism was obviously huge in the 20th century, its goal was mostly independent nations, not really a unified plan for global problems.
So is the crisis of faith worse now? It feels pretty shaky sometimes, looking at the news.
Well, it's crucial to keep that long view. Harari actually suggests maybe it's less severe than past crises.
Really?
Yeah, he reminds us, think how bad things looked in, say, 1918 or 1938 or even 1968. His point is maybe we won't totally ditch the liberal framework because, well, what's the alternative? There isn't another ready-made global story everyone agrees on.
Huh. So maybe we stick with it out of, necessity?
Would be. Disillusioned, yes, but maybe not ready to abandon it entirely. But, and this is the big but, any story that wants to win people over now has to deal with the massive changes from infotech and biotech.
Right. This is where it gets really, really interesting, the technological disruption.
Absolutely. And the AI revolution, it's not just about faster computers. It's tied into breakthroughs in the life sciences, social sciences, understanding how we work, our emotions, desires, choices.
Scientists are learning to, as he puts it, hack humans. That sounds slightly worrying.
It does. But think about it this way. The science suggests our choices, even the really personal ones, might not be free will in the way we imagine. They might be more like super fast biochemical calculations in the brain.
So human intuition is just pattern recognition.
That's the argument. Really good pattern recognition, honed over millennia. Think about doctors diagnosing or investors sensing the market. They're spotting patterns, often subconsciously.
And an AI, with enough data, enough sensors, could potentially get better at spotting those patterns in us by analyzing our expressions, our voice.
Potentially, yes. More accurately, maybe even faster than our own conscious minds can. And that has huge implications for jobs.
Yeah, because it's not just about automating routine tasks anymore, is it?
Exactly. It's the combo of IT and biotech. The insights into the brain could let AI outperform humans in jobs you'd think are safe. Things requiring empathy, judgment.
Like what? Therapy. Security.
Therapy, yeah. Maybe even bodyguarding, anticipating threats. It sounds like science fiction, but the underlying tech is developing fast.
Wow. So it's not just factory workers. It could be psychiatrists, artists. And he mentions this idea of a potential useless class. That's a harsh term.
It is harsh, but the concern isn't just unemployment. It's maybe people lacking the uh, mental flexibility, the stamina to constantly learn new skills in a job market that changes every few years.
He uses the analogy of horses in the 19th century.
Right. They weren't retrained for factory work. They were just pushed out of the economy. And if you learn a new skill now, will it even be relevant in 10 years? That instability also makes it super hard for workers to organize to get rights, especially in the gig economy.
It's a pretty disruptive picture.
Right.
And algorithms shaping our choices even in small ways, like choosing books.
Yeah, the example of publishers optimizing book descriptions for the Google algorithm, not necessarily for human readers.
Right.
It's just a subtle shift.
Yeah.
If the algorithm likes it, maybe our interest is almost taken for granted. Algorithms are starting to, quote, take humans for granted.
So if humans aren't essential as producers, maybe not even as predictable consumers, what protects our well-being? This forces us to rethink social models, right?
Totally. We can't wait until the crisis hits full on. We need new ideas now. And the focus should be on protecting people, not specific jobs. A lot of jobs, let's be honest, are pretty soul-crushing anyway.
So protecting basic needs, self-worth.
Exactly. Which brings up ideas like universal basic income, UBI.
That's getting a lot of buzz, taxing the tech giants, the robot owners, and giving everyone a basic stipend.
That's one model. It could be a safety net, maybe reduce inequality. Another idea is broadening what we even call work,
How so?
including things that are valuable but currently unpaid.
Yeah.
Childcare, elder care, community organizing.
Which, if the government starts paying for those, it might end up looking a lot like UBI anyway, just framed differently.
Pretty much, yeah. It's about ensuring people have the basics covered. Now, shifting gears slightly, this ties into the erosion of individual liberty, the big data issue.
Okay. How does he connect those?
Well, historically, in the liberal view, authority shifted from, like, God or kings to human feelings. Think of elections, referendums. What do you feel about it?
Makes sense.
But Harari asks, what if the next shift is from human feelings to big data algorithms?
Because algorithms might understand our feelings better than we do.
That's the unsettling idea. From a scientific view, feelings are biochemical algorithms, basically. Mechanisms for calculating survival odds. They've been good guides, but maybe algorithms fed with enough data about us could become better guides.
Better at knowing what we really need or want, even if we don't consciously realize it.
Potentially. Which opens the door to manipulation, right? Super targeted ads, propaganda. If governments or corporations can effectively hack our feelings.
He uses the analogy of a pilot with vertigo.
Exactly. The pilot feels like they're flying level, but the instruments say they're in a dive. They have to trust the instruments, even if it feels wrong. We might reach a point where trusting the algorithm over our gut feeling is the rational choice.
Like choosing a university course, our own judgment is flawed, emotional, and AI could look at huge data sets.
About job markets, your aptitudes, long-term trends, and maybe give much more objective advice. It's a trade-off. Autonomy versus potentially better outcomes.
This also feeds directly into inequality, doesn't it?
Absolutely. We see the wealth gap growing, the richest 1% owning half the world's wealth, those kinds of stats. The worry is AI and biotech could pour fuel on that fire.
Turning economic inequality into biological inequality.
That's the nightmare scenario. If life-extending treatments, cognitive enhancements become super expensive, only available to the rich.
Yeah, the rich wouldn't just be richer, they'd be
Right.
better, faster, smarter, living longer, creating biological castes.
Precisely. Historically, the idea that the rich were inherently superior was mostly a myth to justify power. But in this future, it could become a reality, a gap almost impossible to bridge.
Which makes owning data the critical issue.
Harari hammers this point home. Regulating data ownership is maybe the key political question of our time, like land in the past or factories later. Data is the crucial asset now.
And if it gets too concentrated, humankind could literally split into different biological tiers.
That's the stark warning. And think about consumption. If algorithms know you that well, maybe they just start buying things for you.
What happens to advertising then?
It could be totally disrupted. Why bother with ads if you can just ask Google or whatever AI assistant, find me the best car for my specific needs and budget based on all my data? Who needs commercials?
Okay, wow. Let's shift again. Community. In this digital age, Zuckerberg talks about building a global community on Facebook.
Right, and Facebook believes its AI can actually find and strengthen what they call meaningful communities.
That seems ambitious, more complex than teaching an AI to drive a car.
Way more complex. And it raises questions. Can corporations really drive these huge social changes? Historically, it's been things like churches, political parties, armies, groups demanding real sacrifice.
He mentioned the Arab Spring, lots of online organizing, but offline realities took over.
Exactly. And we still have bodies, right? We live offline. We need roads, hospitals, schools.
Hmm.
It raises awkward questions about tech giants who profit massively from online life, but maybe don't pay their fair share for the offline infrastructure we all rely on.
Yeah, that disconnect is real. Okay, what about human adaptability? He contrasts us with chimps.
Yeah, chimpanzee social structures are pretty fixed. But humans, think about Germany in the 20th century. Monarchy, republic, dictatorship, democracy,
Oh.
all in one lifetime. It makes you question if there's some fixed national essence.
And the same applies to religious traditions. They're not as fixed as we think.
His example of gender segregation in synagogues is fascinating. It wasn't always the case in ancient times. Traditions evolve, get reinterpreted, sometimes invented.
But despite all this diversity in nations, religions he sees a kind of convergence, a single global civilization.
In a way, yes. Politically, almost everyone accepts the model of sovereign states, international law, diplomacy. Even if they disagree on specifics, the basic framework is shared. Think the Olympics, tons of national pride. But everyone agrees on the rules of the game.
And practically, too, like with science.
Absolutely. When it comes to building a bridge or developing medicine, or even, unfortunately, building nuclear weapons, everyone uses the same basic physics, the same engineering principles. Iran's nuclear program uses the same science as America's. That shared reality, those common dilemmas, that's the single global civilization he talks about.
Okay, so if we have this emerging global civilization, what about nationalism? Where does that fit?
Well, he acknowledges mild patriotism can be good, inspiring community, sacrifice, but extreme nationalism, that's dangerous.
Especially with modern weapons.
Exactly. He mentions that old Daisy ad from '64, the fear of nuclear war was real even then, and he criticizes something like the Brexit debate for, in his view, mostly ignoring the EU's role in keeping peace in Europe something hard-won after centuries of war.
His point being, preventing nuclear war has to trump my country first.
In a nuclear world, yes, that has to be the top priority. And then there's the ecological crisis,
Yeah.
climate change, rising seas, extreme weather,
Global problems that ignore borders.
completely. And emissions are still rising, even though we know the dangers. Can any single nation fix this alone? Probably not. Even if one country goes green, another might see melting ice caps as an economic opportunity, like Russia in the Arctic.
So nationalism is just the wrong tool for these jobs.
He argues it is. For climate, for nuclear war, and also for technological disruption. AI research, gene editing that's global. One country banning something won't stop it elsewhere.
And ecological crises might even speed up risky tech development.
It's a paradox, but yeah. Desperate times might lead to desperate technological measures. So the bottom line is maybe our main loyalty needs to shift to humanity, to the planet. We need more global thinking in politics, even without a world government.
Okay. What about religion's role in all this?
Well, back in the day, religion dealt with everything, right? Farming schedules, health. It was practical.
Sure. Praying for rain, temple healers.
Exactly. Now, religious leaders still have influence, obviously. But on practical matters, Harari argues they often defer to modern science and economics. A religious leader might need economists to figure out policy.
And then frame it in religious terms for the public.
Often, yes. Science provides the how, religion maybe provides the why or the justification. And if you look at actual economic policies globally, there's often more similarity between countries with different religions than you might expect.
But religion is still a powerful force for identity, for cooperation.
Definitely. It creates shared stories, enables mass cooperation. But Harari argues that when traditional religions get tied too closely to nationalism, they can actually hinder solving those big global problems, climate, nukes, tech, because they focus loyalty narrowly.
They don't encourage that global perspective we were just talking about.
Generally, no. The religious figures with truly universal visions often lack real political power.
Okay, let's tackle immigration. Always a tough one.
He frames it as a kind of deal, an implicit contract. Host country lets you in, you try to assimilate, and they treat you as an equal citizen.
But every part of that deal is debated, right?
Every single part. Is letting immigrants in a duty or a favor? How much assimilation is reasonable? Language, customs, values. And if immigrants don't assimilate, what happens?
That's the anti-immigration argument. If they don't fit in, the host country doesn't owe them equal treatment and maybe shouldn't let more in.
Right. But then you have to ask, how easy is it to assimilate, especially if you face discrimination? Is it fair to blame the immigrant entirely? And judging whole cultures as better or worse is really tricky. Better than what? 16th century Europe, modern Denmark.
And judging individuals based on group statistics is obviously unfair.
Absolutely. So Harari concludes the debate, certainly in Europe, isn't necessarily good versus evil. It's often a clash between two arguably legitimate political positions with different priorities.
Okay. What about terrorism? How does he view that?
As a tactic of the weak, fundamentally. It's theater. Shocking violence designed to provoke the enemy into overreacting.
So the goal isn't military victory, it's causing fear and disruption.
Exactly. And often, the state's overreaction cracking down, restricting freedoms, does more damage and plays right into the terrorists' hands. It destabilizes things, which might be their goal.
Even though states usually crush the terrorist groups eventually.
Yes, but the political storm they create can sometimes achieve the terrorists' broader aims. It's a gamble for them. And in Western societies, we're so unused to political violence now that even small attacks feel huge, existential.
Which leads to the state feeling pressured to put on its own theater of security.
Right, which might involve inefficient or counterproductive measures just to look tough. He also makes a good point about hindsight. It's easy to say later what threats should have been prioritized, like the Clinton administration focusing on Russia while al-Qaeda was emerging.
So prevent nuclear terrorism, obviously, but don't let fear of routine terrorism warp everything else.
That seems to be his takeaway. Keep it in perspective. Now, what about big wars between major powers? Are they obsolete?
He suggests they might be, mainly because they're probably not profitable anymore.
Right. The old logic, conquer land, seize resources, loot doesn't work so well when the main economic assets are knowledge, tech, institutions. You can't easily loot those in a war.
The U.S. won the Cold War without fighting the Soviets directly. China rose economically by avoiding major wars.
Compare that to the costly U.S. adventures in Iraq and Afghanistan. Or Russia's interventions may be more like a playground bully testing limits, aware that full-scale conquest is too costly and difficult now.
So while you can never rule out human stupidity, large-scale war between big powers looks less likely.
Less likely to be seen as advantageous, yes. Which brings us to humility.
Humility as an antidote.
Potentially. For nations, for religions, being more realistic about their actual place in history, their actual contributions.
Yeah.
He debunks some nationalist myths about ancient inventions.
And points out that even influential groups, like Jewish communities historically, weren't central to every major global development. Key inventions happened elsewhere.
Exactly. He challenges the idea that any one tradition holds the key to ethics, pointing out ethical behavior exists in animals, predating human religions. He praises figures like Emperor Ashoka for tolerance.
And suggests maybe religions shouldn't overemphasize their uniqueness, as it can lead to intolerance.
Right. And notes that major scientific contributions often came from secular thinkers, not directly from religious dogma. Morality, he argues, isn't just following commands, it's about understanding consequences and reducing suffering.
He defines secularism positively, too, not just as anti-religion.
Yeah, as a worldview based on values like critical thinking, evidence, questioning authority. Though he admits secular movements can become dogmatic, too, and have their own shadow side.
This ties into the knowledge illusion. What's that?
It's basically that we think we understand things much better than we actually do. Because we rely on the collective knowledge of our group, our tribe. We outsource thinking. It works evolutionarily, but it means we're often confidently wrong about complex issues.
Look, climate change or economics. People have strong opinions based on very little actual understanding.
Exactly, and groupthink reinforces it. Look how political sides line up on issues that aren't intrinsically linked, like environmentalism and gun control in the U.S. It's tribal signaling more than deep understanding. And leaders aren't immune. They're busy. They rely on briefings. Real understanding takes time, even wasted time for reflection.
Which makes understanding justice really hard, too.
Because justice requires understanding cause and effect. And in our interconnected world, The links between our actions and distant consequences, say benefiting from exploitation overseas, are incredibly complex and murky.
So good intentions aren't enough if the results are bad.
It gets complicated.
Yeah.
What counts is a sincere effort to know the impact of your choices in such a complex system. And this leads into the whole post-truth thing.
Is it really new, though? Hasn't humanity always believed in, well, fake news?
Harari argues yes. He controversially points to religion as perhaps the longest-lasting example of stories people believe deeply, which enable cooperation, but aren't factually verifiable.
So fiction isn't always bad. It can be useful.
It's essential, he thinks. It builds societies, inspires action hospitals, charities, all built on shared stories. But fake news can also be incredibly harmful. Think historical scapegoating, blood libels, national myths, political ideologies, they're also built on stories.
Like Goebbels repeating lies until they seem true.
That technique. Though Harari notes it's maybe harder to hide things now with social media compared to Soviet propaganda, his advice: be critical of free information. Maybe pay for reliable news, otherwise you might be the product being sold.
And narrative is powerful in shaping how we see the future, too, like science fiction.
Hugely important. Sci-fi shapes our understanding of AI, biotech. He mentions films like The Matrix, even if reality is simulated, pain and love are still real. Or Inside Out, showing feelings as biochemical mechanisms, not some unified self.
Contrasting with Brave New World.
Right. Huxley's world of engineered happiness, where the savage critiques avoiding suffering instead of learning to cope with it. A really relevant point for us now.
All of which means education needs a serious rethink.
Because the world is changing so fast, who knows what skills will be needed in 2050? A lot of what's taught now might be irrelevant.
So education shouldn't just be about cramming facts.
No. It should be about making sense of information, filtering, seeing the big picture, connecting the dots, developing a coherent worldview. This was always the ideal of liberal education, but now it's urgent.
And lifelong learning, constant reinvention.
Plus, emotional resilience, coping with change, uncertainty, information overload. That's maybe the most crucial skill.
Okay, back to stories. Why are they so seductive, but also dangerous?
Grand narratives, communism, nationalism, whatever, give life meaning. They make small actions feel significant, part of something big.
But they're often very human-centric, very narrow.
Compared to the scale of the universe, yeah. National identities, religious beliefs. How significant are they in the grand cosmic scheme? He uses Zionism as an example, seems eternal to adherents, but it's a blink in cosmic time.
So things like wanting to leave a legacy, belief in an afterlife, they're ways to extend our personal story.
Attempts to find meaning beyond our finite lives. Or finding meaning in the present through intense personal connection, romance. But our whole identity, personal and collective, is built on stories. Doubting them feels dangerous, like society could collapse.
And institutions prop up these stories.
Often, yes. The story might be shaky on evidence, but the weight of tradition, institutions, rituals keeps it going. Think of huge religious institutions.
And sacrifice reinforces belief.
Paradoxically, yes. Suffering for a cause makes this story feel more real. Fasting, pilgrimage, fighting in a war. If people died for this story, it must be true, right? It becomes hard to question.
Like the Shiite mourning rituals he mentions.
Reenacting the story, making it viscerally real. Or religious rules that cause inconvenience, like transport bans on the Sabbath, they constantly remind you of the story, reinforce commitment. But they can also divide society.
And sacrifice can become a substitute for actual ethical behavior.
That's the danger. Someone might act unethically in business, but feel righteous because they donate to a temple or fight for a nationalist cause. The sacrifice absolves them in their own mind.
Nationalism is particularly seductive in this way, simplifying things.
Offering easy answers, a sense of belonging, importance. But look where fascism led. Its appeal, the power of that story is often underestimated. And national borders are often historically arbitrary anyway.
People can hold contradictory beliefs, too.
He suggests different parts of the brain might hold conflicting ideas, like crusaders believing they'd go straight to paradise if killed, but still being terrified of defeat.
So the liberal idea is meaning isn't given, you create it through choices and feelings.
Right. But then he presents an even more radical alternative. Yeah. Which denies both the cosmic dramas and the ultimate significance of our inner feelings. The universe has no meaning. Feelings are just temporary vibrations. Nothing lasts.
The three realities: change, no permanent self, and unsatisfactoriness.
Exactly. Suffering comes from resisting these facts, from clinging to illusions of permanence. God, nation, soul, self.
But even Buddhist societies have had violence.
He points that out, yes. History shows conflict isn't magically erased by Buddhist philosophy. So he's skeptical that just meditating more will bring world peace. We still create stories, find reasons to fight.
So where does that leave us, if all the big stories are fiction?
Reality still exists. Pain is real. Suffering is real. The fundamental question isn't what's the meaning of life, but how to stop suffering.
And seeing reality clearly without the stories is the key.
That's the argument. Giving up the fictions allows you to observe reality more directly, and that understanding can liberate you. He talks about his own search, finding philosophy and academia wanting.
And current brain science can't fully explain subjective experience either.
Not yet. Which led him to meditation vipassana, specifically as a practical tool. Not just reading about the mind, but observing it directly. Your own mind, your own experience.
He's critical of scientists just studying meditators' brain scans.
Yeah, he argues that's indirect. Like studying love by measuring hormones instead of actually being in love. Direct personal observation of your own mind, he believes, yields deeper insights.
Wow. Okay, that was definitely a deep dive. We've covered a huge amount from Harari's work: tech, politics, identity, stories. It's all connected.
It really is.
Yeah.
And it leaves us, and you listening, with a pretty big question to chew on, I think.
Which is?
In this world, increasingly run by algorithms, by these huge global forces, how do we cultivate both critical thinking about the world and also a deeper understanding of our own minds? How do we navigate all this ethically, effectively, maybe even find some peace in the middle of it all?
A lot to think about. An invitation, really, to keep exploring these ideas and what they mean for each of us.